Greetings, beginning Photoshop students. Today I want to talk to you about utilizing adjustment layers. It's a relatively new feature of Photoshop and one of the most powerful features that your layers panel has to offer. I want to talk to you a little bit about working with adjustment layers as opposed to using image and adjustments that you may already be familiar with. We'll work with bringing up the adjustment panel and the adjustment dialog box and the various options available to you there, and working with using adjustment layer masks and creating an adjustment masks to say very specifically which areas of an image you'd like to apply the adjustment to, and then working with the layers panel options for manipulating and making changes to your adjustment layers. So there's a lot of levels involved here, and I think it'll help if we look at an example. So here's an example of an image that when I first took the photo, I remember how bright and saturated the fall colors were in the background, and it really contrasted with the snow that was coming in. In addition, I also remember the foreground elements here, the leaves and also this awning. It's like kind of an entry zone to a ranch, had a beautiful wood structure, and it had a lot more detail. So I'd like to bring both of those back, and I can do this using adjustment layers. To bring up an adjustment layer, you can do this in two ways. Adjustment layers can be accessed from your layers panel using this drop down here, or you can go under Window and Adjustments, and that will bring up the Adjustments dialog box. You can use the back button to look at the specific types of adjustments that are available to you in the dialog box. And notice as I roll over the various zones, it brings up the different adjustments that are available to me. And you can see that change right up here on the top left. And then, of course, returning to individual layer adjustments and setting all of the parameters for an individual adjustment. So that's how those can be accessed. So if I have this image and I'm not really happy, first of all, with the saturation of the colors, I can create an adjustment layer. Here's an adjustment layer in which I've increased the saturation of the colors overall. In order to create this layer, I just simply created a hue and saturation adjustment layer. It brought up the adjustment in the dialog box, and I was able to actually use the sliders while still looking at my image and figuring out, okay, that's kind of the level of saturation I remember from that gorgeous fall day. So when I'm happy with that correction, I can simply close the dialog box. If I'm unhappy with what I've just done, I can reset the tool to its original non-adjusted state by hitting the rewind button at the bottom. If I were going to return, if I decide I want to use a different adjustment, I can return to my adjustment list and select a different adjustment there. So I'm just going to delete this adjustment layer for now and take a look at the one that I actually used. So much more saturated colors, much happier with that. But still, I have the problem of these elements here in the foreground are getting lost. A lot of their detail, important detail in the wood and the color of the foreground leaves. When you create an adjustment layer, Photoshop automatically creates a mask for you. And that mask is linked to the adjustment. And that's how these symbols are indicating here in this adjustment layer. This mask, which has, it's actually the entire image is unmasked for this adjustment layer. So the hue and saturation adjustment was applied to everything versus this levels adjustment layer in which I masked out the background in order to apply this levels adjustment only to the foreground elements. So you can kind of see how that works, and you can actually see the mask, and it's related to that shape of the foreground elements. Well, how did I make that happen? I first needed to create a levels adjustment layer. So with this one turned off, we'll go ahead and create a new one. So I create a levels adjustment layer. And then what I need to do is I need to mask out that background. Probably the easiest way for me to do this would be to use my quick selection tool and select the foreground elements and then select the inverse of them in order to mask out the background. And so I'm using my quick selection tool and I'm having a pretty good time of it here, selecting only the foreground leaves as well as that, there we go, as well as this foreground element here that had the wood. And of course, I can change brush size and relative hardness to get in and get some of the nitty-gritty details. And once I'm pretty happy with the selection that I've made, I'm going to select the inverse so that only the background is selected, which means now I'm going to apply the mask only to the background. I can do that using my brush tool, and I can select a fairly large brush from the brush panel here, and I think I'm going to bump up its hardness a bit. It can actually be a pretty hard brush. And I close that panel out, and I can actually now, with this mask selected in this new levels adjustment, I can go through and actually brush, and you can see as I apply my brush, you can see how this mask is changing right before your eyes. If the panels are in the way, you can just simply move things around so that you can see what you're doing as you create your mask. So I'm masking out the background areas. And I can kind of see how this mask is growing simply by using this handy-dandy tool. I can use a larger brush if I want to hurry things along and just select this huge area. And again, keeping in mind that I'm adding to the mask, I'm masking out the background. And now I can bring up the levels and adjust that levels by clicking on and selecting this levels layer, and I can bring my adjustments back up under Window and Adjustments. And I think I need to start with bumping up the midtones so that I can see some more color in the midtones. And I'm just going to drag the sliders and midtones and highlights until I begin to see more color here in the foreground leaves and more color in the foreground wood elements that I'd like to bring back some of that detail. And I can close the panel once I'm done, or if I've overdone it, I can reset the tool. And once I'm pretty happy with what I've done, I can deselect that background, going Command D or Control D, or simply going under Select, Deselect. I'm going to move some of these layers around. I can close my Adjustments panel and check and see how I've done, and I feel that I'm fairly happy with the adjustments that I've made. Now what if I look at these adjustment layers and I think, you know what, I might have overdone it a little bit with the saturation. I can actually use the opacity slider on the layers panel to pull back on that adjustment a tad. So I'm only going to apply maybe 65% of this adjustment layer, this saturation adjustment layer. You can see if I pull it all the way down to 0, then we get the original saturation of the original image. So using the opacity slider in conjunction with your adjustments layers really gives you a lot of control over just how much you want to change and adjust these items. So that can be very powerful. You can also use the drop-down menu in the Layers panel of the various blending modes. So I could even maybe use a screen adjustment if I really wanted to bring up even more bright colors where I've already used the levels adjustment. I can use the screen blending mode. You can see if I go back to normal, there's a little bit of a difference there. So I can also use blending modes to further enhance the adjustment layers. And once again, the most powerful thing about the adjustment layers is that I can turn them on and off as needed. And they are non-destructive. You can see that non-destructive way of it hasn't harmed the original image. I can always get back to that original image. So this concludes your introduction to using adjustment layers to enhance your digital photography.